we're going to discuss an issue that is concerning some people in the town. There's been a lot of bears, B-E-A-R-S, black bears, seen in this area in recent weeks. Some people have concerns. They're worried about safety. They're not used to seeing a bear in their driveway or at a playground or at a city center in White Plains, in a garage, in a department complex, store complex. They've been all over. And we invited Emily Carrollo, who is with the DEC, the New York State DEC, to tell us a little bit about bears and what we should expect, what we should do, and what, if anything, the state does. So Emily?
Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate it. And everyone can hear me well, right? My mic is all good. Okay, great. So today I'm here to talk about some of the black bear concerns that we have had quite a few call-ins from, especially Westchester County in particular. Obviously, there's plenty of other complaints coming around from the region in general, but Westchester is a little unique, mostly because of its landscapes and obviously some of its major city centers, and being so close to New York City, it always brings in quite a bit of concern and a lot of questions from the public in regards to black bears and black bear behavior, and especially how to remain safe around black bears. So Paul invited us to speak today. I am going to be the main speaker, but we do have some other people on as well that might be able to answer some questions from the DEC that will, if there's any questions I might not know the answer, they can hopefully follow up with the responses that might help everybody find some good resolutions. So I will be doing a presentation today. I apologize if it's a little short notice, because I didn't really know too much about doing a presentation. So hopefully it'll kind of get across a lot of the information I wanted to cover today. And if there are any other questions or concerns, I will definitely be taking questions at the end from any of the public that might feel as though maybe something wasn't answered in the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and share. It says the host has disabled attendee screen sharing.
Yeah, now you can do it. Try it now.
Okay, great. So we're going to share this presentation. Okay. All right, so as I stated before, I am a wildlife technician for the Black Bear Program for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. I specifically work out of Region 3, which is the region that Westchester is located in. Our head office is in New Paltz, New York. So not too far from Westchester, but a little bit of a hike. And today, like I said, we'll be talking about black bears and specifically how to hopefully help resolve black bear conflict and any black bear safety concerns in Westchester County. And I do like to point out, there we go. A little bit about myself. I have been working with wildlife for several years now. I actually have my undergrad and my master's in wildlife related fields. Specifically with black bears, I've been with this program for about 1.5 years, but I've done other black bear work in Pennsylvania as well, and have worked with multiple predator species around the country and actually even internationally. I think the most relatable thing that I have when it comes to the public though, and a lot of the concerns, especially coming out of Westchester County, is I actually grew up in northern New Jersey. I grew up in Sussex County, and as many of you may know, there are a lot of bears in New Jersey. So I grew up in black bear country and learned how to interact with bears and wildlife safely. And I always joke that I'm one of 6 kids and we all made it out alive. So it is very safe to be around actually black bears. And they are a species that I'm hoping my coverage today will help the public understand how to interact with black bears a little bit more, and also how to understand their behavior and their biology, and know that when they see a black bear, it doesn't mean imminent danger, but how they can help alleviate any concerns or safety concerns that they may have by avoiding black bear conflict. So currently in New York, there are 6,000 to 8,000 bears in the state. About 30% of them occur in the Catskill region, which includes the mid-Hudson Valley. So about 1/3 of the black bears that we'll find in the state are located in this region. They are very well established in the Hudson Valley. That wasn't necessarily true about 30 to 40 years ago. They were really mainly found in the Catskills. And then with a lot of the management techniques that we put into place and various protections, they were able to reestablish themselves throughout a lot of the home range and territories they were originally found in when settlers really first arrived here in New York. We do include, in some parts of the Hudson Valley, we are looking to actually even reduce some black bear numbers, preferably through like hunting management. So black bear biology, adult males weigh about anywhere from 150 to 660 pounds. So obviously that's a huge range, but to give you a general idea of how big on average males are, they're about 300 pounds. I'd say most of them that we see, and especially the ones that we capture, tend to be a little bit smaller, but those big Bruins definitely exist out there. But definitely down here, down in Westchester County, I'd be very surprised to see some of the larger bears. Majority of those large males are found in other parts of the state where there's a little bit more isolation and the ability to avoid a lot of the possible mortality events, such as roadways, that allow them to grow old and get as big as 600 to 700 pounds. Females weigh anywhere from 100 to 200 pounds, and on average, they're about 170. So they're significantly smaller than their male counterparts on average, but you can see still a pretty big adult female. They're about 2.5 to 3 feet at the shoulder, so when they're standing on all fours. And at birth, cubs weigh about 7 to 11 ounces. I always think that's a fun fact to throw in there because it is very interesting to see, a cub that is only about a self 1.5 worth of weight grow into such large animals. It's pretty wild and gives us a better idea of how much they really need to consume throughout the summer to grow to those sizes. Their average lifespan is about 20 to 25 years in the wild, but unfortunately here in the Hudson Valley, because of especially the number of roadways, really seems to be one of the #1 mortality reasons for black bears. They don't always hit that age range, but they can live to be pretty old. And home range, which is pretty important here in this discussions that we'll be having today. For females, on average, it's about 10 to 20 square miles, and for males, it's about 10 to 100 square miles. So males wander very far, and that will be very relevant in a second. So black bear diet, I think this is something that we always are very concerned about, especially because black bears, just looking at them look very large and intimidating, and people really, I think, assume the worst, and that's not necessarily to anyone's fault, because like I said, they are large, they are a little mysterious, they can be very intimidating, they do have big canines, so you would think that they can be these really monstrous hunters, but in reality the main part of a black bear's diet includes a lot of soft and hard mast, and that really is very seasonal throughout the summer. So right now, some of the main diet preferences that black bears will have will be ripening berries, as you can see down actually in this picture, especially the blackberries, mulberries, blueberries, huckleberries, all these guys that are really coming to a ripening stage at this point. And a lot of these bushes can be found especially out in a lot of our parks. So you'll see quite a few bears. They love to just plop themselves down and just eat a ton of berries. They love any kind of wild greens. This is especially true in the spring when some of the first sprouting greens that we'll see are skunk cabbage. That's really popular among black bears and other wildlife species here in New York. And insects and nuts, especially acorns and beech nuts, come the fall, more of their hard mast, become another huge part of their diet. So black bears essentially are always looking for the most amount of caloric energy intake for every meal that they find. And that does very occasionally include live prey as well. I'd see the majority of the live prey items that they go after if they do hunt something, because I always remind people that black bears are incredibly lazy. So they really want to put in minimal amount of energy when it comes to collecting these resources. And typically the live prey items that they do include would be white-tailed deer fawns, and that's typically in the first couple weeks of a fawn's life, where their natural defense is to just lay there and try and hide and blend into their environment. So they're not really running away. As soon as those fawns become mobile, I always joke and say that really are just like, nope, I'm good. I don't really feel like, you know, trying to chase after this fawn. If they're pretty quick and they're pretty agile once they get their legs underneath them. So black bears, like I said, they like a nice, easy meal, like berries, soft mass, insects especially, and they do appreciate the occasional roadkill, or if they find an animal that may have passed away in the wild. Now, with that being said, because black bears are very lazy and they want the easiest meal possible, this does also get them into trouble. So garbage and bird seed are really some of the #1 complaints that we get when it comes to black bears ending up in more urban and human-dominated landscapes. And what this typically entails is normally black bears, they'll come in and they'll investigate. They can get comfortable in a human environment, and so they might be willing to, especially at night when there's a lot less human activity, investigate a lawn, see if there's a bird feeder up, see if there's any garbage available. And really what it comes down to is the ease of access to these resources, and the fact that especially bird seed has such a high energy content and fat content that helps them pack on those pounds when it comes to the winter time. And then they obviously have to use those extra fat stores to make it through the winter. So this becomes very important when we're talking about human bear conflict and how to avoid human bear conflict. And other things we need to think about beyond garbage and bird seed are things like pet food outside, compost piles, grills that may not be cleaned fully, anything that might attract a bear. And mind you, a black bear's sense of smell is incredibly good and can smell things upwards of a mile, if not even further away, depending on the wind and depending on the landscape. So we need to recognize as humans that if there is an easy meal and there are black bears around, they're more than likely going to find that. Again, this is a little bit of black bear numbers over time. So to give you an idea of the number of black bears that we've been seeing, it has obviously been increasing in the Catskills, which becomes important when we talk about black bear encounters with humans, and obviously the human expansion in certain parts of the mid-Hudson Valley as well. So as black bear numbers have increased, human numbers have increased, black bear conflict has increased. This gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the current range of black bear ranges that we see here in New York. Obviously, the entirety of the Southeast New York is considered black bear range, whether it be primary range, which is preferred habitat, or secondary range, which is habitat that we would see bears, but typically they don't tend to stay too long in. And I like to point out that obviously Westchester is part of that secondary habitat. Again, to give you also a little bit of an idea of black bear densities across the state, again, in a lot of our mid-Hudson Valley region, there is a nice number of black bears, especially in the eastern part. There is quite a bit of black bear activity and a high density of black bears in the western part, to the point where we're actually trying to maybe look to reduce black bear population numbers, just simply because of the really some biological reasons, such as the carrying capacity for black bears in the area, and also to help avoid black bear conflict. And I like to point out as well that we do identify Westchester County as incompatible for black bears. And what that basically means is not so much that we don't ever expect to see black bears down there, because obviously we do, but we don't expect an established population of black bears to really occur there anytime soon. And a lot of this has to do with the habitat requirements that black bears need to survive in the wild. So again, getting back to our black bears and some of the trouble that they may find, we do have 4 levels of conflict. There is the basic observation, then we have a minimal interference. So this would be our calls that we get about someone reporting a bear that got into their bird feeder, for example, down here, and it hasn't really been reoccurring, but they're just letting us know. Or maybe there's been a bear that's visited a dumpster locally a couple of times. Would typically be something that we consider a category 3 bear, a bear that we're not overly concerned about. Obviously, it's doing things that we don't want it to, but because no repetitive patterns have really been created yet, we're not overly concerned. And obviously, if the bear is behaving in a way that avoids human interference or wants to avoid any kind of human conflict, for example, as soon as it gets, clapped at or yelled at, the bear takes off running. That's what we would consider a category 3 bear. A category 2 bear is when we start to see some more concerning behavior. So a lot of repetitive actions, whether it be garbage or bird feeders, or maybe they're consistently seen going on porches, is when we start to get a little bit more concerned. But again, a lot of Even these category 2 bears can be bears that can be negatively reinforced to avoid that behavior, despite the little bit of pattern that has been established. And then once we get to category 1 bears is when we really start to become concerned about their actions. So maybe this bear has gone in and actually killed a sheep, or maybe this bear has gone in and broken into a home. And these are the reports that we take very seriously. We collect as much information as possible. We try to understand why the event occurred, because typically in these situations, it's not a single event that just occurred out of the blue. There's typically a lot leading up to these kinds of threats. And to be clear, these kinds of bears, or a category 1 bear, is very seldom. We don't see these bears often. These reports are not something that regularly occurs, but they can occur if attractants aren't appropriately managed right from the beginning. If attractants, especially by the public, are managed, any kind of actual category 1 bear occurring becomes extremely rare, and is something that we would not expect to see when the public is taking the appropriate actions to avoid bear conflict. So to give you an idea of the amount of complaints that we've been dealing with in Region 3, obviously over the course of years, it has increased. There's a little bit of up and down, and a lot of this has to deal with natural availability of food out in the wild. So in years where natural food sources are low or not very great, typically conflict tends to go up because bears are finding more unnatural resources because their natural food resources are depleted or are not very in not very high quantities. We don't believe that this is one of those years that there are quite a few complaints coming in, but it's fortunately there is quite a bit of soft and hard mass out there for bears to consume out in the wild. So this isn't a year that we would expect necessarily these complaints to remain high because of an unavailability of natural food resources. To give you an idea, and I think this graph and maybe even the next one really gives an idea of the number of complaints that we deal with over the course of a year and when we're really expecting to see the highest amount of black bear conflict throughout the state. And this is really true throughout the majority of Northeast states, is that in June and July, it is our peak time for bear conflict. And I always like to point that out to people because a lot of the time, you know, it seems as though, especially this time of year, people, because of the amount of conflict that they're seeing, they think that there's more bears in the area or the population has suddenly increased. And a lot of it just has to do with the time frame that bears are most active. And in the summer, this is really when they are very, very active and when they're moving the most. And specifically from like the end of May until the end of July, beginning of August is that peak movement period. And that's for several reasons. Give you kind of a little bit of an individual line taken out. So this is from 2019. And at the end of May is when we actually start to see sows or female bears kick out their current yearling bears. So those bears at this point are about 1.5 years old, and they kick them out to go find their own home territory. Typically, when these young bears disperse, males in particular will travel very, very far, and they can travel even hundreds of miles to try and find a new home range or new territory where they are not being threatened by older, more established adult bears, and where they can find adequate resources. So that's why we see a lot of black bear movements and a lot of black bear activity and complaints coming in around this time frame. It's not necessarily because the black bear population is suddenly growing, it's suddenly out of control. It's a lot of it, it just has to do with their natural behavior and their natural movement period. And that's where we believe these bears in particular that have been seen by a number of people in Westchester County, we think there's a couple of bears involved that are just young bears and they're trying to find a home range where they can settle down and establish. Now, with that being said, typically these bears will move out of the area pretty quickly. You know, they're just continuously moving all day long and trying to, like I said, find an area where they can settle. However, bears especially, and young bears especially, might hang around in certain areas longer than we would necessarily want them to, not because they plan on settling in Westchester County, but because they are finding other resources that are allowing them to stay there. And typically that involves unnatural or human resources. So for example, if a young bear, you know, wanders through the town of Greenberg and it is kind of just meandering through, if it starts to find a lot of bird feeders, if it starts to get access to a lot of garbage, it's going to be hanging out in that area longer than I think a lot of us would want the bear to hang out, not only for the bear's safety, but also for human safety as well. So that's why we highly encourage, especially during these peak movement time periods, to really be aware of the attractants that we have in our yards. This is very, important for things like garbage and things like bird feeders or other animal feed that we might have outside that are very attractive to bears and might encourage them to stick around. So a lot of the conflict resolution. Black bears are generally extremely weary of humans. They really want nothing to do with people. And I know sometimes, like as I stated before, that black bears can be really intimidating. They can be really scary. At the same time, they're also very revered as an incredible animal. I mean, they are incredibly resilient. I've seen black bears recover and do extremely well from pretty major injuries. And they're really respected here in New York and obviously other states as well. And so it's sometimes difficult to believe that this animal that maybe is an animal that we've respected for a number of reasons, not only because of its general behavior, but also because of its strength and its power that it naturally exudes, that these bears are afraid of us. And I always try and really reiterate that point with people, that black bears want nothing to do with people. They really want no human conflict. They see us as their natural predator, and their instinct to avoid predators is natural in the sense of they, in some areas of the United States and in other areas of North America, they actually can be a prey species for other species such as brown bears or such as wolves, mountain lions, that did occur formerly here in the eastern United States, but obviously no longer do for many, many years. But their natural behavior of finding cover and preferring forested habitats goes historically back to when they were seen as a potential even prey item for other animals. And so that's why their natural behavior is to avoid conflict and avoid anything that might be risk related or cause some kind of injury or potentially even death. And this 110% includes humans, and even the smallest of humans is what I like to remind people of. So they can adapt very well to living in and around human-dominated landscapes. And this is very important to remember. This is very important to remember because obviously people become surprised when they do see them in urban or suburban landscapes. And it's not that they necessarily will settle down in these areas, but they do very well on the outskirts of human landscapes because of the unnatural food resources that they can gain access to. So it's just a reminder that it's not surprising to see black bears, especially in Westchester County, but obviously we're trying to have them or avoid having them really settling down or trying to continuously find food resources in these areas. So what I like to really reinforce is that if we remove the attractant, we will remove the bear. If a bear doesn't have a reason to continue to be in that area, it will understand that and remove itself from the situation. And I always give the advice of risk versus reward. We need the bear to understand that if there's no reward, there's no attractant, and on top of that, we're harassing or hazing the bear, which I'll get into in a second, that bear is going to start to understand, okay, not only am I not getting any reward or resource for being in this area, but I'm potentially putting myself at a greater risk by being involved with humans. Let me go back really quick. And I also like to point out, obviously, these pictures are of exactly what not to do. I'm going to reinforce that again, around black bears. We don't want to encourage them to feel comfortable in a human landscape. So obviously that means not only intentionally feeding bears, that's a big no-no, but incidentally feeding bears. It goes back to removing trash, removing bird feed, removing other resources that they might find attractive. And it also involves harassing or hazing the bear. So I joke and say, be a good neighbor and don't be nice. Don't invite them in for coffee like we do with our neighbors. We don't want bears to have that impression. And especially in an area like Westchester, where we understand that the habitat for black bears is not that great. So when it comes to hazing black bears, this is something that we encourage everybody to do. And growing up, especially in northern New Jersey, it was something I was taught at a very young age to understand that it's important to, if a haze a bear or harass a bear, and have it understand that we don't want it close to the house. We don't want it in the neighborhood. We want this bear back in an area where it will feel more safe naturally because it's avoiding that risk of human contact. So this can occur in a number of different ways. And some of the best ways that we suggest harassing black bears is really very simple. We suggest clapping hands, banging pots and pans. Air horns are one of the biggest suggestions I make to everybody because they are super accessible, they're super cheap. You can put one in every window, you can put one in every door. I've had people tell me that if they know a black bear is in the neighborhood, they walk around with an air horn. So if they do see one, they can use the air horn when they're traveling, and that's a great idea too. In certain circumstances, they might need a little bit more harassment when it comes to black bears, especially if it's a repetitive behavior. I love these critter getters. They are really awesome. And I suggest them, especially in situations where there is a specific area you don't want the black bear to be. So for example, if there's a chicken coop, or if there is a point in the garage or a shed where maybe a black bear is attempting to break in or has broken in. A critter getter is an awesome little tool. It's a motion censored alarm. And I think what makes it work the best is it's very surprising. And black bears do not like surprise. They don't want a surprise birthday party. They don't want their friends to plan anything like that. They hate surprises. They want to know where the threat is coming from at all times. So critter getters are great. They're very discreet. They're super effective. They're loud and they're surprising and they work really well. And in the end, in these situations where if a black bear is not responding to any forms of harassment, it is really reluctant to leave a resource alone, we will go in and trap and haze bears on site. But I like to point out that this is only done when attractants we know are removed and the household itself has tried its best to get the bear to leave. And then when we trap and haze bears on site, we are essentially doing what we suggest the public does to a much greater scale. So when we trap those bears, we're harassing them with things like rubber buckshot or things like paintballs, things that are a painful stimulus, but obviously are not going to more physically harm the bear in any way, shape, or form. And this really helps establish a negative connection or a negative association with that property or area. But that only works if the attractant is removed. So in the end, a lot of people in the public or people across the region have extreme success by doing and taking those two steps by just removing the attractant and hazing the bear at a much smaller scale than what we do. Because bears in the end, as I again want to reiterate over and over again, want nothing to do with people and see people as a significant threat. And I always inform people as well that even if a black bear walks away, that is a good sign. They don't have to take off running. They don't have to, practically look like they're, gonna pee themselves because they're so scared. I just want the bear to leave. Across the DEC, we want the bear to understand that, okay, there's a potential threat here. I'm removing myself from the situation. That is what we want to see behavior-wise in a black bear that gets the point and is understanding it's not welcome. And we get that question a lot where it seems as though people are concerned that the bear only ambled off or only walked off or took, a couple minutes to get the point. And in the end, if I hear that black bear did leave, I tell anyone who calls in or asks for information that they've done their job and they're doing the right thing, and to continue those processes, especially if a black bear has been consistently finding a resource at a location. It may take a little extra harassing or a little extra hazing for the bear to finally get the point, but it will move on and it will move back to natural resources as long as there's consistent behavior from the public and from the homeowners and landowners that are involved. We do like to point out that we have a black bear response manual online that is available to the public. It's on our website. I always tell people the easiest way to find anything on our website is probably through the search bar. So if you just go to DEC.ny.gov, which I think I'll have that website up in a second at the end of the presentation, you can type in bear response manual, and it'll bring you to the PDF that goes over how we handle bears, how we collect the information and the complaint information, how we enter into a database that helps us keep track of complaints over time, and the types of response that we'll have in various situations. So one of the specific examples I always like to point out too is that in very specific circumstances, we will go in and remove bears from an urban location. And typically in these circumstances, the reason why we are behaving this way and why we are removing this bear is because this bear imminently has the opportunity to come in contact with not only people, but some other form of human interaction that might cause danger to people. So specifically, actually in this situation, the main reason why this bear was captured was not only because of the high possibility it would come in contact with someone while trying to escape the city, which is actually the city of Poughkeepsie, but there was also the arterial, which I don't know if anyone has ever been to the city of Poughkeepsie, is an extremely busy road, and people fly down that road, unfortunately so. And so the likelihood that that bear was potentially going to cause a vehicle collision and cause damage and harm not only to itself, but to any people involved was why we came in and removed this bear. But in these specific circumstances, we have the opportunity to also respond. And you know, we've gotten a couple questions from the public as to why we haven't potentially gone down to Westchester and just trapped and removed these bears or relocated these bears. And one of the biggest reasons why is in a number of these circumstances, the bear actually wasn't in an area long enough for us to respond. And that's actually a good thing. That means that the bear is moving on. It's not finding those resources to hang around, and it's continuing doing what it's doing and behaving the natural way it should behave. And that's by continuing to move through and wander out and avoid conflict. So in these circumstances, you know, we will go in and remove bears, but it has to be very specific circumstances that are in that situation for us to be able to respond first and foremost, for us to be able to respond safely, not only for the bear, but most importantly, especially for our staff and for the public safety. And also because in the end, for these bears, when we do remove them and relocate them, they don't, you know, typically come back. But in some of these circumstances, when it comes to actual relocation of black bears and trapping them, removing them from situations, it actually tends to not work. And this is especially true for adult bears that are well established in an area. So that's why relocation normally is not something that we do other than these very, very, very special and unique circumstances of a bear, for example, this one in the city of Poughkeepsie. So some of the conflict management tools that we do use, to give a brief description, we do use hunting as a conflict management tool. Outreach is another huge and very important management tool that we use. So doing talks like this, especially to towns that have concerns, is very important. And we work with a lot of other groups that are not only research related, but education related locally in our region that help spread the word of how to interact safely with black bears.
When you relocate a bear, do you relocate it out of its home range?
So specifically in those circumstances when we do relocate a bear, and that the only time we ever do this is if it's a bear in an urban circumstance, for example, the one that just was on the slide, we relocate it to the nearest forested landscape that's typically a public property. So whether it's a local state park or a DEC managed wildlife area or forested area. So for these bears that we tend to remove out of those situations, they're pretty much always young adult males. And it's typically always anytime from the end of May to mid-June that we are removing these individuals, because like I said before, it's that time of year and time of season that they are dispersing. So those individuals, I'd say, you know, like 90% of the time that we remove those urban circumstances are actually not established in the home range. So that's what makes it successful to actually remove them and relocate them.
White Plains, about a week or two ago, there was a bear seen in a parking garage at the city center. It's a, you know, one of these shopping, you know, developments. If the bear had been there, you know, more than once, would that be an instance where the bear could have been removed? Because it was in the middle of a city, roaming around major roads, crossing busy streets.
Yep, and we actually get these conversations and calls a lot. And, you know, in that specific circumstance, the return is not so much that what we're concerned about. In the end, the bear kind of has to be in a location where we could actually handle it. More often than not, what the situations that we respond to, local PD has really been chasing the bear around for several hours, typically from like the wee hours of the morning into late morning, that we finally get the call that the bear is typically stuck up in a tree, but occasionally maybe stuck in someone's backyard or stuck in a shed or something like that. And that also allows us to actually respond. So in these circumstances where the bear is still roaming and still has the ability to move pretty freely, we don't really have, unfortunately, the ability to respond. So, you know, in those circumstances, what we try to encourage is that typically we'll have a conservation officer respond on scene. They'll make sure that the area is safe. They'll also make sure that they can try and encourage the bear to take the various potential routes out of that situation. So even if there's like a minute little bit of cover, forest cover, brush cover that the bear can get into and then find its way out of the area. You know, typically, unfortunately, these bears, they will end up crossing roadways, but if it's in a situation where the bear is not in a very specific respondable location. So again, stuck up in a tree and it's being, you know, held up there by officers because, you know, we've told them, yes, that's an area that we want to remove the bear, just make sure it stays in place. Then we can't really, unfortunately, respond. So it's not so much the repetition of the bear or returning to these areas. It's more along the lines of, what does the area look like cover-wise? Is there an escape route for the black bear? How many people are in the area? Has it become, you know, like a spectacle in a sense where now it's, you know, the bear stuck up in a tree and there's 30 people down below the tree and the bear can't get away? There's a lot of different circumstances that go into making those decisions, but I just like to make it clear that it's by no means that we're unwilling to respond. It's just it has to be really special and unique circumstances for us to respond. And it also involves, again, a huge safety aspect of not only for the bear itself, but most importantly, the safety of our wildlife staff and the safety of the public in the area. Something that I like to mention to people as well, obviously, you know, immobilization, or what more people understand as like a tranquilizer when you tranquilize animals, but when you immobilize an animal, that animal does not just drop down and it's asleep. Typically the drugs that we use take at least several minutes to take effect. So if that bear is not in a location that we can watch it go down safely and watch it fall underneath anesthesia, unfortunately that bear, if it's in a location that it can run, it typically will run if it started, and can then increase the likelihood of that bear encountering a danger, not only for itself, but also encountering people or encountering a car or something like that if it runs off. So again, it has to be very specific circumstances that we can respond. And that's why whenever we do get these calls, we take in as much information. And one of our first lines of defense and first lines of response is our conservation officers. And they're very well trained and have great communication ability between us and the wildlife managers. So they then can understand, okay, this is where the bear is. A lot of these officers have dealt with urban bears before. They can compare it to other urban situations and say, well, it is like XYZ, but maybe it's not like this situation where that was required. And they'll typically have, give us a good idea of what's going on and how we can respond. And a number of times, sorry, really quick, a number of times we will get calls about urban bears, and an officer will respond and the bear will actually be gone at that point. So that's why they're typically the first people to respond and give us an idea of whether or not wildlife needs to come and remove that bear.
I remember when I first after I got elected, shortly after I got elected in 1997, there was a black bear that was found at Venetian Delight. It's a restaurant on Central Avenue in Hartsdale, and the bear, it's known for their pizza, and the bear was eating some of the pizza, and I think it got national attention for Venetian Delight because they felt that if the pizza was good enough for the bear, it's probably good enough for everybody else. But the question is, the DEC did respond in that case and removed the bear. When was the last time the DEC was in Westchester or in this area of southern Westchester, and actually was called to remove bears?
You know, I don't know specific circumstances. I do believe a couple years ago there may have been a bear in White Plains that was removed. I know there's even been bears removed. So it's not like this is an unlikely circumstance, and that's why I explained that the sighting of a bear is not uncommon. It just has to be very specific circumstances to be able to respond to these urban situations. I mean, to give you maybe a better idea, so far this year we've removed 2 urban bears, one from the city of Poughkeepsie and one from the city of Beacon. In those circumstances, they were really just the perfect ability to respond, and there really was a high likelihood that that bear was going to encounter a lot of troubles getting out of the city, and in the areas of the city where it was going to encounter a lot of conflict and potentially cause not only harm again to itself, but most importantly the public that would be involved in its encounters and its escape route. So with that being said, especially a lot of our wildlife managers and especially the biologists for our region has been responding to these kinds of calls for 15, 20 years, and that extends even further into DEC history as far as responding to bears that are in places that they probably shouldn't be. And so there's a very great amount of knowledge behind the decisions that are made when it comes to those responses. And so I never want the impression that the DEC doesn't respond and we don't care about the safety of people, because that is our number one concern, and that is why we make the decisions we make, because we have to understand the pros and cons of actually coming in and immobilizing that bear and removing it. And if the cons outweigh the pros, as far as like, yes, it's great to remove the bear and move it somewhere else so maybe it doesn't encounter as much conflict, but if it's going to be at the risk of causing safety concerns for other people and for our staff and for the public, then we have to make, decisions based on the safety concerns and safety situations that are involved.
I just had one other question. I'm sorry. If there's, I live in a complex and there's a black bear near a playground in my condo. And how long so people were freaking out, how long does a bear usually like say they're at a playground, how long do they typically stay at the same location?
I would say that, typical black bear behavior is they're pretty much constantly looking, moving and looking for food. And so in that situation, if there were no resources that the bear was finding, more than likely that bear within minutes, would remove itself, or within 30 minutes, a short time frame would remove itself from the situation, because obviously it's probably hearing and potentially even encountering people in that area doing, the whole like, oh, it's a bear, and then running away kind of deal. And they recognize that, they assess the threat, and if they go, you know what, there's not really much around here, I'm not really finding anything, I'm just going to move on. And that is their main focus, and their main goal is to find food resources. And especially in urban areas like this, really what they're looking for is, garbage, they're looking for birdseed, they're looking for other things that are pretty easily accessible in urban and suburban areas like this. So I wouldn't be surprised if that bear in that situation kind of was just meandering through. And sometimes bears really just, they might not be in an area really looking for anything. They might just be wandering through that area going from A to B. So there's a very good chance that that bear just walked right on through, just so happened to walk past the playground and kept going on because it was going for another resource or trying to make its way to another habitat where it was more in a more preferred habitat in an area that it would rather be in than, in a slightly more suburban or urban situation where it's obviously its safety becomes a concern.
And the last question, if somebody had mentioned to me that bears sometimes like kiddie pools, is that, and they're attracted to the small little, pools with water that people sometimes have for their little kids?
I would say that they're not necessarily attracted to them. Like, it's not going to bring a bear into the neighborhood, but that's not to say that if they come across a water source and it's a hot day, and they might just lay in it, especially if maybe it's a sow with cubs, they might, which I don't think we've had any encounters, especially in Westchester County, with a female cubs, because if a sow is there, it's typically some sort of established home range. But Anyways, so if they, encounter a situation like that, they might take a drink, they might hang out, play in the pool for a couple seconds, and then keep wandering on. Again, the black bear is going to do everything in its power to avoid human conflict, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it won't find itself in more human-dominated landscapes. And I think one of the points that I really would like to make in particular is that, when we are in a situation where we do know there are bears in the area, first I like to point out that black bears are very aware of their surroundings. They have incredibly great sense of smell, as I mentioned before, and they also have very great hearing. So they know well in advance who is around and what is coming towards them. And that's a good thing. We want them to be that way because they will remove themselves from a situation before we even get remotely close to bears, or to the black bear itself, or to the individual. And what I also like to point out, though, is that if we do have food resources that bears are getting into, sometimes that can hinder their ability to have full awareness of what's going on. And I think probably to talk to a point that people are concerned about is obviously having a close encounter with a black bear. I was able to see a video, I believe it was potentially in Rye maybe, where a woman was walking her dog, and she kind of came around the corner, started walking back into her yard, and the bear was actually right in her front yard. And it's actually a very interesting video, and really kind of solidifies the point of the fact that bears want nothing to do with people, and that they do not want to have any sort of contact with a person, because in that situation, the woman kind of comes around the corner and almost encounters the bear. The bear almost looks like it does partially bluff charge, but as it charges her, it kind of goes in the opposite direction of where she's kind of running now a little bit, towards her home. And it kind of continues on and gets to the road, and then it stops and it just keeps walking away. And so even in a situation like that, where it was very tight circumstances, and where it was very surprising for not only the poor woman that unfortunately was probably very scared, but also for the bear, that bear wanted to do everything to get itself out of that situation. It was like, whoa, hold on a minute. I don't want to be here. I don't want to be involved in this. I don't want to have a conflict. I'm going to remove myself. So being aware of the fact that if you are, if you're going out at night and you're putting your garbage out and it's dark out, I always tell people, like, clap your hands a couple times. Just make yourself noticeable. Make it your actions obvious. And that black bear is going to know that you're coming, you're around the corner, and it's going to remove itself from the situation. We don't have to worry about bears trying to actively harm or harass people, and even children. I know there's always a huge concern about kids in the area, and if a child encounters a black bear. And I can say from personal experience that, growing up in black bear country, where, the encounters of black bears were significantly greater than what we would find in Westchester, that encounter is so unlikely, and it's also very preventable. And that's what we need to teach, especially, not only ourselves, but young children growing up. How do we interact with wildlife? How do we respect wildlife? What do we do if we encounter a black bear? And I can go over that a little bit towards the end of this conversation. Just kind of understanding if there is a bear in an area, just being aware of your surroundings as well is always a good idea, because despite the fact that the bear is going to do everything it can to avoid a conflict with a human, if there is a circumstance, which, this is what I explain to people when they talk about, the quote unquote, and I use that because it's hard to describe these moments as attacks, but the attacks that happen in New York are not because this black bear went out and like revenant style attacked somebody. It's because someone maybe went around the corner, went to go put trash in their garbage, and the bear didn't hear them. And the bear gets just as surprised and scared as the individual does, and turns and pops out of the garbage and swipes on the way out and takes off running. And those are the attacks that happen in New York. Those are what we record as attacks. And I like to really use that term lightly, because again, it's not what we would assume as, we hear bear attack and we assume the worst. We assume some sort of intentional, fearful kind of attack of a bear on a person. But in reality, it's really the bear actually, being just as scared as we are and just as surprised as we are. And, what we would do in a horror house when someone turns a corner and surprises us, they take a swing and they run off and go to the other direction. So it's being very aware of your surroundings and being obvious about your actions, especially at night when we know that in urban areas, bears are more active. Bears are typically getting into more human resources at night. And because humans as a species don't function very well at night, because obviously our main sense is sight, being very obvious about your actions and being loud, being, you know, aware. So if a bear is in the area, they hear you come in and they're gonna remove themselves and they won't want anything to do with that conflict.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, we're running out of time. If we had anybody in the audience who had, you know, maybe we could spend maximum of like 15 minutes if people have any questions.
Emily, I had a question. This is Jim, and I live in Ardsley, and I have a fenced-in backyard. I have a dog, and I let the dog out at night before she goes to bed, and I'm concerned about her encountering a bear and pinning the bear, maybe in a corner or something. So the question that I have, and I probably have a follow-up after it, is how is the bear likely to behave if that happens?
So again, you know, bears are going to do anything they can to remove themselves from situations of any potential threat. And, you know, even for small dogs, this is even the case. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that it's not like just because something's smaller, it's going to be like on a black bear diet. So they're going to automatically take it as, especially majority of dogs, what they'll do is they'll actually scare off bears. And they'll be the chaser of the bear and the bear will be the chasee, unfortunately. So in these situations, if the bear was truly cornered, which even in a fenced-in yard would be a little tough, because believe it or not, black bears are incredibly great climbers. And they are very resourceful when it comes to getting themselves out of situations. I would say that the bear is going to be able to remove itself and you wouldn't encounter a problem, because it's not going to do anything to the dog unless it absolutely has to. And even still at that point, you know, the situations we hear with, you know, pet attacks or pet conflicts with black bears tends to be where the bear has swiped just to get, you know, a break in the attack to make it out into another route. So it is something to be aware of. Again, to be very honest with you, we had dogs growing up my entire life and plenty of bears, and we never actually had you know, a bear come into an encounter with our dogs. There are, unfortunately, in the state of New York, there are reports of bears getting, you know, having encounters with dogs. And I think, you know, the best suggestion I could give right now is that if you are concerned, especially at night, what you could do is go out first yourself. You know, open your door, close it so the dog's waiting by the door, and just clap your hands, take a flashlight, get a really good flashlight, shine it around the yard a little bit. And if that bear sees that kind of activity, it's going to take itself out of the situation and remove itself. And so then you won't have to worry about the bear or the dog actually encountering the black bear.
Mm-hmm. And my follow-up to that was, then how should I react to that? If the dog does encounter the black bear, pin it in the corner, say, what do you suggest I do?
In that situation, very honestly, I would try, if you know that the bear is stuck and is cornered by the dog, your best bet is just going to be to try and recall the dog as best you can. I would not get close to that situation. And that is where you could see a bear behave aggressively, because it is truly trapped. And again, the likelihood for a bear to really be stuck in that kind of situation is very slim, because they are really good about, you know, having an escape route, and they are excellent climbers across the board, whether it comes to a plastic fence or a wooden fence. So I wouldn't worry too much about that situation actually encountering, but I would not then go ahead and put yourself in that situation, because, you know, I guess it's really kind of relatable in the sense of, you know, you're trained about first aid and stuff like that. You have to assess the situation first, right, before you go and help somebody. And you don't want to then create an additional emergency or an additional problem by putting yourself in unsafe circumstances. So in that case, the best bet is to just try and recall the dog as much as you can. Maybe if you can take a hose, if you have a hose accessible, or if you have an air horn, anything that distracts not only bear and dog, but especially the dog, to kind of back off and remove itself from the situation. Because then as soon as the bear has the ability to take a different route out, if it's truly cornered, it's going to remove itself. So being armed with something like an air horn, or maybe having a hose, you know, kind of accessible, would be a good idea, because then that could distract the dog and get it kind of off of the target of the bear.
Great, thank you, Emily.
Any other questions? No? Any board member have any questions? this has really been a really fantastic presentation. And, I could see how lucky the state of New York is to have somebody like you who's so passionate about this and so knowledgeable. And, you really represent the best of state employees. So I think the state DEC should be very proud that you're working from them. And if it'd be smart, they would make sure that you don't go to another government agency.
Thank
But
you.
thank you very much. This was really
I think that George Calvi might have had a question.
okay. George?
Thank you. I was wondering if you could see me. Emily, I came prepared tonight with a very long prepared statement, but thanks to your presentation, you pretty much deflated my ire somewhat. So I'm not going to read that long statement. However, I'm not entirely sold. The bear that Paul referenced earlier in the evening was in the White Plains City Center. Could have been killed by a startled motorist in both the garage or on the avenue. That's very, very possible. I mean, after all, bears are not deers and rabbits. People and bears do not mix. In my humble opinion, we're not in a position to wait for a Category 1 conflict. Personally, I think relocation of bears in urban areas should be a matter of routine, and we should not wait for a conflict. But, not everybody agrees with me.
And I totally understand that, that concern, we really do. And it's not so much that we're waiting for circumstances to get worse, because we obviously don't want them to. But in the end, as I was kind of explaining before, if there aren't the circumstances to be able to respond, and it's hard to describe those circumstances because typically they are unique from very situation to situation. And as I stated before, especially in those scenarios, we always have a conservation officer respond on scene. And especially in those situations when that conservation officer responds and the bear is already gone, there would be very little that we could honestly do. And I'm not saying it because we're trying to get out of the responsibility of moving bears or relocating bears, but in the end, if that bear is in a situation where we can't safely dart it to remove it, then there's really not much we can do. So again, kind of getting back to the point of when we do trap bears and when we do remove bears from urban situations, the specific circumstances we're really looking for is a bear that we know we can safely dart, and that bear will remain in that area when it's darted, because there is a risk as well that if we dart that bear and it's not in a spot where it's going to stay, so for example, if it's like stuck in a shed or actually stuck in the garage or up a tree is typically normally when we encounter these bears, then there's really safety-wise, there's very little we can do. And we understand that there could be an encounter of especially a vehicle collision, and that is always very disturbing. And obviously, as you guys know, down in Westchester, vehicle collisions with wildlife is a pretty big deal, especially with deer and other larger game animals. So we do very much so understand that importance of, and the emergent scenarios behind those situations. But again, it kind of goes back to the possibility, even the ability for us to respond. So I think in that circumstance, it sounds like the bear was not really in a great spot for us to actually be able to dart it, watch the bear safely go down, make sure it wasn't going to run off into a crowd or run off into traffic, and then also be able to handle that bear in a safe location, and then also be able to collect it and then bring it out of a situation. And I like to remind people as well that when it comes to trapping bears, it's not really as simple as just placing a trap and collecting a bear. It seems that way because obviously they love donuts and cake, and that's one of our best tools of trapping. But in the end, if we don't really know where that bear is on any given moment, or where they're really regularly hanging out within like probably a half a mile radius or a mile radius on a regular basis. I mean, this bear is seen every single day behind someone's yard for a week, then it's really difficult for us to have a trapping location that would even make sense, because it's not just like we can place a trap and the bear's just going to go in it. It's really, I wish it was as simple as that, because it would make our job a lot easier when it comes to responding to these situations. And in the end, the number one defense when it comes to black bear conflict and black bear concerns that are not only in Westchester, but across the board, across the entire state, across the entire region, is for people to understand attractants and containing attractants, especially garbage, birdseed, pet food, is the #1 way to avoid bear conflict. If you don't have a reason for the bear to be around, the bear will not be around. Or if it does pass through, it's not going to hang around. And that's very important to understand. So in the end, I believe that from what I can tell, it doesn't seem as though we've been getting as many calls about these bears in the area. So it seems as though they may have started to move on or remove themselves a little bit. I would not be surprised if we get a couple more calls about them. We do encourage, especially, questions or especially conflict reports. Maybe a bear has gotten into the garbage, to be called into our regional office. And it's actually a general wildlife line. I can provide that to Paul at the end of this conversation. So if people do have questions, they can always call in and they will talk to a DEC wildlife staff member that is very intelligent about any kind of bear conflict. And if they feel as though it's questions that they can't answer, they will forward it along to my boss or I to be able to address it. But that is really the #1 defense when it comes to preventing black bear conflict. And this is especially true in Westchester County, is if we get neighborhoods on the same board about removing attractants, the likelihood that these bears will hang around and create a potential danger for not only maybe a human encounter, but a vehicle collision is going to be significantly decreased.
Okay. Thank you, Emily. And thank you, Town Board, for making this forum possible. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Hey, Paul, it's Chief Ryan. How are you?
Hi.
Hi, Emily. Thank you so much for your presentation this evening. Very informative. So part of the problem we have down here in responding is that the population, the area is very densely populated, and there are the attractants as you described them. City of White Plains is full of restaurants. There are dumpsters everywhere, a highly urban area. There are parts of Central Park Avenue, which I equate to Route 9 up by you, very, very densely populated area as well. So I think it comes down to our ability to keep the bear in sight, to track it if at all possible. We tend to be very transient. But at the same time, we're trying to alleviate the fears of the public through education. But again, it's not a good outcome for the bear in most cases, unless they can retreat to a wooded area. And our parks, the areas around here, some parks that maybe serve as a refuge. But just by sheer population density and the configuration of the roadways, there are so many major road thoroughfares coming through the town of Greenburgh that it is a concern at our end. And we look at it we reached out a few times for the, hopefully to have your officers respond to possibly tranquilize a bear. It didn't happen this last time, but obviously once the bear gets into the city of White Plains or the city of Yonkers, it's a whole other dynamic there. There's very little room for the animal to go. It's a very highly populated area, and there's not a whole lot for us to, as far as pushing that bear, driving the bear out of there to a more wooded area, so to speak.
And I totally understand that concern because obviously that's normally, fortunately, we typically have local PD respond typically first. And what's great is that you guys normally have a really great working relationship, not only with us, but our local conservation officers. And, on those scenes, what we normally suggest is that if the bear is, even remotely close or in some sort of vegetated area where it can even just be pushed into the nearest vegetated area, typically bears will hunker down until they feel it's safe to move, which might mean during times of less human activity or less driving capability. And, unfortunately, when it comes to the roads, it's a really tough wildlife topic overall. I could probably give a whole other presentation of hours long of how roads affect wildlife movements, how they are a major mortality source for not only black bears, but a number of different wildlife species, as I'm sure many of you know. So when it comes to, the vehicle collisions, it's obviously something we're trying to avoid, but we also have to recognize that in those situations, again, if the bear is not in a spot where immobilizing it would keep it in a single area that we could safely handle it, or, for example, if it's right next to a road, but it's if we were to dart it, it could run across the road. Not only are we increasing the chance that that bear will get hit, but we also have to worry about our ability to cross roads as well. And so it's by no means that we don't take the road crossings, you know, seriously. Obviously, that was a part of it in the Poughkeepsie. It was a part of the situation for sure. There was a little bit more of a background of the bear kind of being chased around for several hours from like the wee hours in the morning until well into the morning. And it just kept getting further into the city rather than going away and out of the city. So it was kind of a lot of things that went into the decision to remove that bear. But again, in these circumstances, especially as a chief, what I would suggest is, you know, communicating with local PD, like, listen, if there is a bear situation, this is who you should call first. You know, you can communicate with wildlife, and then obviously our next step would be to get a local conservation officer out there. I'm not sure if you have our conservation officer numbers.
Yeah, there's a local officer.
At your,
Yeah, we have it. Thank you.
beautiful.
Appreciate it.
That's great. And then if you have their number, being able to get in touch with them as well would be really the best next step. And then that way it can start to kind of get all the connecting pieces and all the communication together to decide whether or not we need to remove that bear. So, but thank you for responding for those to those situations, because local PD makes a really big difference when it comes to our responses.
Thank you for your assistance as well. Appreciate your presentation too. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Good, so thank you very, very much. We will share this video with people who have concerns about bears in the future. And again, thank you for your responsiveness.
No problem. And I'd just like to mention really quick too, Paul, that website that I had up there, and I can send these to you, called bearwise.org, is a fantastic resource, and it has information from a number of different regions of the United States that deal with very similar circumstances as Westchester. So it's a really great resource as far as bear information goes, and I can send some of these links to you as well, so you can be able to provide them to the public also.
Great, thank you.